What if there was something scarier than a Halloween monster? November 1st was supposed to be a calm day for a small police precinct in Montana. But as the officers settled in, their calm shattered when an unexpected guest stormed through the doors, drawn in by something irresistible. What happened next would leave the precinct and everyone inside reeling. On the morning of November 1st, 2024, a police precinct in a small Montana town was relatively calm. Officers yawned and stretched as they settled in after a chaotic Halloween night full of prank calls, costume scuffles, and lost kids. The station was buzzing with that post-event feeling, tired but relieved. Candy wrappers, empty coffee cups, and half-eaten snacks cluttered desks, the remnants of a night spent refueling on sugar and caffeine. Most of them couldn't wait to get back home and rest after the busy night, but there was still paperwork to be done. Still, the morning was fortunately trouble-free, and they could work at a calmer pace. Or so they thought. A thunderous crash exploded through the station, and just like that, the peace and quiet of the morning was gone. Officers jumped, pens flew, and a few donuts rolled to the floor. In disbelief, they stared at the front entrance. A massive grizzly bear, drawn by the alluring scent of leftover snacks, had smashed through the glass doors and was now inside. The beast stood there for a moment, a massive, heaving figure with fur that seemed to fill the entire doorway. Its eyes flicked from side to side, nostrils flaring as it took in the room and the smell. Instinct kicked in. Officers scrambled, overturning chairs and knocking over coffee mugs in their hurry. One officer attempted to shield his work from the animal, only to see it scatter with a single dismissive swipe of the bear's paw. The grizzly, undeterred by human presence, continued its rampage with impressive, terrifying calm. Desks were flipped as officers tried to put barriers between themselves and the beast, hoping it might lose interest. Papers scattered like leaves in a gale, forming a thick blanket across the floor. A few unlucky suspects in holding cells watched in horrified fascination, eyes wide, not sure if they should root for the bear or pray it didn't decide to venture into the cells. The bear's next target was the duty officer's desk, where a bowl of leftover Halloween candy sat invitingly. It pawed through the mess with surprising delicacy, as if picking its way through a grocery store aisle. Candy corn flew as it nosed around, chomping whatever seemed edible. A few brave officers attempted to edge closer, waving their arms, yelling, trying to divert its attention, but the grizzly seemed unimpressed. It bared its teeth, sending them scrambling backward with hearts pounding. A fresh wave of chaos erupted when the bear lumbered toward the sergeant's office, pushing desks and chairs out of the way as if they were toys. The office, still filled with the faint smell of leftover pizza from the night shift, was quickly stripped of anything edible. Officers huddled near the walls, trying not to move, while others attempted to form a barricade. The bear simply ignored their futile efforts, casting aside drawers and filing cabinets as it looked for more treats. Finally, one of the officers had an idea. He gestured frantically to others to open the evidence room, which housed a stash of Halloween candy. They hoped it would lure the bear into a confined space, sparing the rest of the precinct. It was a risky plan, but they didn't have many options left since they didn't want to shoot a moving target in a very cramped space. The officers retreated, making as much noise as they could, waving bags of candy to bait the bear toward the evidence room. Sure enough, the grizzly, intrigued by the scent trail, lumbered after them. They darted out of the way as it sniffed its way to the open evidence room door, letting out a low growl when it caught sight of the stash inside. Once the bear was inside, they slammed the door shut, barricading it with every available desk and chair. For a brief, precious moment, they thought they'd won. But the grizzly, now practically intoxicated by the sugary scent, had no intention of being contained. Inside the evidence room, it launched a frenzy of destruction, tearing into bags of candy. The scene was baffling, like something straight out of a movie. They didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. The officers on the other side of the door flinched at each thud, each scrape, and every resounding crunch. Wildlife experts had already been called, but they were miles away. So the officers waited, tense and on edge, as the grizzly continued its candy-fueled rampage. Every so often, there would be a lull, as if the bear was catching its breath, only to start up again with renewed vigor. Bags of evidence, paperwork, and anything not bolted down went flying in a sugar-fueled whirlwind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wildlife team arrived with tranquilizer darts. They cautiously approached, loading the darts with enough sedative to knock out an animal of the bear's size. The officers waited, breath bated, as the team quietly set up outside the evidence room. The door was opened just a crack, and a dart shot through the air, embedding itself in the bear's thick fur. The bear let out a surprised grunt, lumbering around in confusion. It shook its head and took a few staggering steps before the tranquilizer began to take effect. The mighty Grizzly swayed, eyes drooping, as it slowly sank to the floor, surrounded by a mountain of candy wrappers and torn plastic bags. The officers sighed in relief as the bear finally collapsed, snoring softly amid the sugary chaos. The wildlife team worked quickly, loading the sedated bear onto a transport vehicle to relocate it to a safer, bear-friendly habitat far from the tempting smells of human snacks. As the adrenaline wore off, the officers surveyed the wreckage. The station was a disaster zone. So much for an uneventful shift. Still, they had to make the most of what they had. For the rest of the day, the precinct buzzed with retellings of the bear attack. The officers couldn't believe they'd just lived through the wildest incident of their careers. The early spring air in Glacier National Park was crisp and quiet, the kind of silence Lily always cherished on her solo hikes. It was mid-morning in March 2023 when Lily moved steadily along the narrow trail, enjoying the solitude before the summer crowds arrived. Snow still clung to the higher peaks, glinting under the sun, and fresh buds peeked through the earth. The park was waking up from winter, and so were the bears. But Lily was unaware of the possible danger. She hiked and hiked, delighting in the scenery. The young woman paused by a small stream, taking in the clean air and the refreshing sound of trickling water. It was then she sensed it, a subtle rustling just beyond the line of trees to her left. Lily only half turned toward the sound. Surely it must have been a squirrel. But then she caught sight of something straight out of a nightmare. A massive grizzly bear emerging from the underbrush, its nose twitching, drawn by the scents lingering in the cool spring air. Her scent, faintly masked by sunscreen and sweat, and the food in her pack. Lily's heart pounded, but she forced herself to recall everything she'd learned about bear safety. She kept her gaze low and moved slowly, avoiding sudden movements, but the bear's gaze was locked on her. Curious, perhaps even hopeful. After a long, dormant winter, its hunger was sharp and unyielding. Lily took slow steps back, glancing around for anything that could serve as a cover or a defensive position. Her eyes landed on a large rock off the trail. The boulder jutted from the ground, rough and sturdy, and she decided to make her stand there. Step by step, she edged toward it, keeping her eyes on the bear without fully meeting its gaze. The bear's ears perked forward and it lumbered a step closer, clearly unfazed. Reaching the rock, she positioned herself with her back against it, hoping its size would serve as a partial barrier. The bear continued to close in, its massive paws padding softly, muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. She could see the intensity in its eyes now, a relentless focus that sent a cold surge of fear through her. She pulled out the bear spray, her last line of defense, and held it ready, praying she wouldn't have to use it, that something or someone would save her from a fight she knew she'd lose. But the bear was undeterred. It sniffed the air with greater urgency, catching the whiff of food in her pack. Desperate, Lily fumbled inside, pulling out anything edible and tossing items one by one to the side as a distraction. First a bag of nuts, then a granola bar, each hitting the ground with a soft thud. The bear paused, momentarily intrigued by the scattered food. It lowered its head to sniff the snacks, chewing them methodically, but the brief interest faded. The human in front of it smelled far more appetizing. Its gaze returned to Lily, sharper now, and the distance between them closed once again. The bear drew closer, its nostrils flaring as it caught fresh waves of her scent. Lily felt her back press harder against the rock. That's when she realized she was trapped in a vulnerable position. She knew running wasn't an option. There was no way she could outpace a grizzly. Her mind raced, trying to remember if there was anything else in her pack she could use. She found her metal water bottle, and with a surge of determination, she tossed it past the bear, hoping the sound might distract it again. The bottle clanged against a stone, and for a moment, the bear shifted its gaze. It ambled over, investigating the new noise, and she seized the precious few seconds to pull herself up onto the rock, elevating herself slightly. But the bear returned, pawing at the ground with increasing frustration. She could feel the tension rise, the animal's impatience growing. The beast was done with distractions. She was the main prize now, the source of all these curious scents. Its lips curled slightly, exposing teeth stained yellow and sharp. She could feel the weight of the bear's stare, almost as if it was calculating the steps it would take to reach her. Running out of options, she looked around desperately and spotted a small tree just a few steps away. The branches weren't thick, but Lily was a petite woman. She was confident she could climb it. She knew grizzlies were able climbers, but she saw no other options. Lily took a deep breath, mustered all her remaining courage, and as the bear hesitated near the rock, she bolted to the tree. In one swift motion, she grabbed the trunk, hoisting herself up as high as she could. She clambered, adrenaline flooding her veins, gripping each branch with white-knuckled hands. Below, the bear charged, swatting at the base of the tree, the trunk vibrating under the impact. Her pulse hammered in her ears, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She wrapped her arms tightly around a branch, feeling it sway slightly under her weight, but holding strong. From her vantage, she could see the bear circling below, growing increasingly agitated. It pawed the ground, let out a low, guttural growl, and occasionally rose onto its hind legs, trying to get a better angle on her. She could feel the strain in her arms and legs as she clung to the branch, the rough bark digging into her palms, but she dared not loosen her grip. Minutes ticked by, though they felt like hours. The grizzly didn't relent, its eyes never leaving her, pacing and growling, the hunger in its gaze unmistakable. She clung there, fighting waves of exhaustion, wondering how long she could hold on before her strength gave out. Then, faintly in the distance, she heard voices. Hope flared in her chest, and she looked down to see a small group of campers emerging from the trail. They froze at the sight of the grizzly, but their arrival startled the bear just enough. Suddenly, feeling overnumbered, the animal ran away. The campers rushed over, helping Lily down as her legs buckled. They exchanged silent looks, their expressions mirroring the relief and lingering fear that she felt. Together, they backed away, keeping an eye out for the bear. Finally, they made their way down the trail, calling the rangers on a hiker's emergency radio to report the encounter. The rangers arrived quickly, checking the area, but the memory of the encounter remained with Lily. The massive, relentless grizzly had tested her courage and resolve. And though she'd made it out with barely a scratch, she knew that her early season hike had come with a reminder that Glacier National Park, for all its beauty, was still very much a wild place. In July 2022, at a remote summer camp nestled in the mountains, a group of young campers, aged between 10 and 15, sat wide-eyed in the main cabin, hanging on to every word of the survival lesson. The counselors taught them about wildlife safety and explained in detail what to do if they ever encountered an animal in the wild. The air buzzed with excitement mixed with a tinge of fear as the campers learned about mountain lions, wolves, and most intimidating of all, grizzly bears. Outside, the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the forest floor. It was quiet, peaceful even, except for the occasional bird call and the distant rustle of leaves. Breakfast had been finished an hour earlier, and the scent of bacon and eggs still lingered faintly in the air. Unbeknownst to the campers and counselors, that smell was slowly drawing in an uninvited guest. As one counselor explained the importance of staying calm in a wildlife encounter, a camper seated near the back window gasped, eyes fixed on a dark shape moving just beyond the glass. A massive shadow shifted, pressing against the cabin wall, blocking out the sunlight. Another camper noticed, then another. Before long, the whole group had fallen silent, their eyes widening as they realized what they were seeing. Outside the window, a large grizzly bear was moving around the cabin, sniffing the air, its powerful body pressing up against the thin walls. It had caught the scent of breakfast and wasn't about to leave until it found the source. The campers froze in silent terror, barely daring to breathe as the bear's shadow loomed, circling the cabin, grunting softly. Without missing a beat, one of the counselors locked eyes with the campers and signaled for calm. Despite their shock, the counselors knew they had to protect the children. They moved swiftly, quietly instructing the campers to gather near the emergency exit. But then, with a creak and a splintering crack, the bear pushed its way through the old wooden back door, which gave way under its weight. It forced itself inside, head low, sniffing the floor, grumbling as it searched for the food scraps it had smelled from outside. The kids pressed against the far wall, hearts pounding as the bear lumbered into the kitchen area, its massive body dwarfing the narrow space. It moved with terrifying confidence, jaws opening to reveal teeth stained from years of tearing through the forest's toughest roots and prey. Its claws, curved and sharp, scraped against the floor, sending chills down every spine in the room. The counselors motioned for the campers to stay quiet, guiding them closer to the emergency exit one by one. The bear sniffed the air in deep, rumbling breaths, drawn to a cabinet that still held leftover food from breakfast cleanup. It approached with slow, purposeful steps, swatting aside a chair in its path as if it were nothing. The chair clattered against the floor, but the bear barely flinched, too focused on its goal. One powerful paw batted at the cabinet, tearing it open with a single swipe. Pots and utensils crashed down as the bear dug through the shelves, tossing cans and jars aside as it searched for food. The campers watched in horror, their eyes glued to the bear's every movement. A counselor led them to the emergency exit, cracking the door open as quietly as possible. One by one they slipped through, shuffling silently into the narrow path that led away from the cabin and down toward a wooded clearing. The campers were instructed to crouch and move quickly, their feet barely making a sound as they slipped away. Inside, the bear was growing impatient. It swiped at the remaining cabinets, knocking supplies onto the floor in a thunderous clatter. A bag of flour burst open, coating the air in fine white dust that settled on the bear's fur. Undeterred, it plunged its snout into the mess, licking up crumbs and scraps, oblivious to the campers sneaking away. The counselors moved with the last few campers, keeping a careful watch on the cabin, ready to intervene if the bear noticed them. But the animal was far too distracted, now tearing into a cardboard box full of snacks, ripping it to shreds, tossing wrappers and crumbs everywhere. The destruction was complete. The kitchen was left in ruins as food and supplies were scattered across the floor. Finally, the group reached the safety of a small, sheltered outpost, tucked into the trees. The counselors ushered the campers inside, securing the door and peeking out the windows. They had no idea how long the bear would stay, or if it would wander off after finishing the food. Minutes ticked by slowly as the campers sat in tense silence, some gripping each other's hands, others staring wide-eyed at the door, imagining the bear bursting in after them. An hour passed, with every second feeling like an eternity. They could still hear the occasional crash from the direction of the cabin, the bear's sounds of frustration and triumph as it continued its rampage. The counselors kept watch, whispering reassurances as the campers waited, hearts still racing. Finally, the sound of approaching footsteps brought relief. 2 park rangers emerged from the trees carrying bear deterrent gear and radios. The counselors explained the situation in hurried whispers, and the rangers nodded, assessing the area. One ranger cautiously approached the cabin, circling to make sure the bear hadn't noticed the campers' hiding place. The rangers moved in, clapping their hands and using noisemakers, driving the bear away from the cabin. A larger team was on its way, ready to tranquilize and relocate the bear in order to make sure this didn't happen again. When the rangers signaled it was safe, the campers and counselors returned to the cabin. The kitchen was unrecognizable. Chairs were toppled, the cabinet doors hung loosely from their hinges, and flour coated nearly every surface. Food wrappers and broken containers littered the floor, the aftermath of a hungry bear's visit. For the campers, the lesson was unforgettable. They'd seen firsthand what it meant to encounter wildlife and learned how to stay calm under pressure. The counselors assured them they'd done well, and although the experience had been terrifying, they left the outpost with a new respect for the wild. By the end of the day, the story of the bear in the cabin became a camp legend, passed down from camper to camper. The evening air in Yellowstone was sweet on September 1st, 2023, with a faint scent of pine drifting through the trees. Grace, Kevin, and their 10-year-old daughter Kayla had chosen the perfect spot for their camping trip, almost hidden by trees beside a gentle river. They had spent the day exploring trails, casting lines into the river, and eagerly planning a night of stargazing. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, they gathered around their small fire, ready to marvel at the stars above. After dinner, Kevin meticulously packed away all food scraps, following every precaution in the camping guide. He secured their supplies in bear-resistant containers and stashed them in a tree a safe distance from their tent. They knew the importance of keeping food away from bears, especially in these remote woods where anything could happen to unprepared campers. Satisfied, the family crawled into their tent, eager for a peaceful night under the open sky. Just as they were drifting off to sleep, a low rustling sound pulled Grace from her half-sleep. She listened, holding her breath, and felt Kevin stir beside her. The noise grew louder, heavy paws padding softly against the forest floor. A faint, guttural snort followed. Grace's heart pounded as she realized what was outside. A bear, perhaps drawn by the lingering scent of their meal. The bear's shadow loomed against the tent, its massive silhouette illuminated by the fading firelight. It moved with a deliberate, unhurried curiosity, sniffing at the ground and brushing up against their tent with an almost testing nudge. They stayed still, scarcely daring to breathe, while Kayla clung to her mother's arm, wide-eyed in silent terror. Kevin clenched his fists, willing the bear to lose interest and move on. After a tense few minutes, the bear moved away, plodding over to the area where they'd stored their supplies. Time stopped. The family lay listening as the animal nosed around the secured containers, sniffing and pawing at the ground. Grace hoped it would wander off, but instead, the bear circled the campsite, drawn by the faint scents they couldn't quite erase. Finally, after what felt like hours, it wandered into the woods, leaving the family shaken but relieved. The next day, they found claw marks in the soil and paw prints near their tent. But it was daylight, and in the warmth of the sun, the danger felt distant. They reassured Kayla, explaining that wild animals sometimes wandered through, but she remained cautious, casting glances toward the tree line as they ate breakfast. Kevin doubled down on the safety precautions that night, even checking their bear-resistant containers twice. But the bear returned, its persistence unnerving. As darkness settled, the family heard it again, moving through the trees. Its massive form appeared beside their tent, closer this time, each step sounding like a soft thud in the quiet of the forest. The bear's snout pressed against the tent fabric, nudging it as though curious about what lay inside. Grace squeezed Kayla's hand, feeling her daughter tremble beside her. Kevin grabbed the bear spray, his grip steady but his heart racing. They knew they couldn't move, couldn't make a sound without risking provoking the bear. The bear exhaled, fogging the thin barrier between it and them, filling the tent with the rank smell of wild fur and musk. It lingered for what felt like hours, its enormous weight pressing against the earth, making the ground beneath them tremble. Eventually, it withdrew, but it didn't leave. It circled the campsite again and again, sniffing, its low huffs cutting through the stillness. In the morning, they discussed leaving. Grace was worried. She felt like the trip had suddenly become too dangerous for her daughter Kayla. But Kevin argued they'd come so far and had hoped for a full weekend of camping. Even more, they had done everything right. They were cautious and followed the rules. Surely the bear would move on. That night, they kept the lantern on in the tent, hoping the light would be enough to make the bear stay away. But the animal was persistent. It returned, completely unfazed by the glow. It pawed at the bear-resistant containers, frustrated by their inaccessibility. Then, with a huff, it turned its attention back to the tent, padding closer with a new boldness, unafraid and clearly not about to leave without a reward. The family lay still, feeling trapped as the bear's shadow loomed, pressing up against the tent wall again. It clawed at the ground, grumbling in frustration. The thin barrier between them and the animal felt like paper, and every move the bear made seemed to push it closer to breaking through. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine as he realized this bear wasn't just curious. It was familiar with human food and had likely raided campsites before. The bear pawed again, making the fabric ripple. Kevin knew the animal wouldn't stop now. Its persistence only grew with each failed attempt, emboldened by past success. Finally, he turned to Grace, the urgency in his eyes clear. He mouthed the plan silently, abandon everything and head for the car. She nodded, her face pale in the lantern light. Grace clutched Kayla's hand tightly as Kevin gripped the bear spray, inching them toward the tent's emergency exit. With a slow, deliberate movement, he unzipped the back of the tent, the sound barely a whisper in the darkness. They crawled out, staying low, keeping their movements smooth and silent. Behind them, the bear continued to paw at the tent, oblivious to their escape. They moved carefully, making their way down the path that led back to the parking area. The forest seemed endless in the dark, shadows stretching between trees, every twig, snap, and rustling leaf amplifying their fear. Kayla clung to her mother, stifling gasps as they stumbled over roots, every step bringing them closer to safety but feeling like a lifetime. Finally, their car came into view, a beacon of hope. Kevin unlocked the doors, helping Grace and Kayla inside before climbing in himself. With a final glance back, he saw the faint glow of their abandoned campsite and the hulking shadow of the bear still prowling around it. They drove back to the park's entrance, adrenaline still pumping, the reality of what they'd escaped settling in. The next morning, they met with wildlife authorities, who informed them that the bear had likely grown accustomed to human food from careless campers. It was an unfortunate reality in bear country, a reminder of the thin line between wilderness and safety. As they packed up and left Yellowstone, Kayla sat in the back seat, gazing at the trees passing by, the weight of the night's terror still fresh in her mind. She understood now the wild power of nature and the fragility of human safety against it. The 10-year-old was grateful for her parents, who ultimately had managed to protect her against a huge threat. On a crisp autumn morning in 2020, Ben Abbott set out on his mountain bike, the cool air biting at his face as he sped along a secluded trail in the Rockies. The trail was quiet, carpeted by green and brown pine needles. The only sounds were his tires crunching over the rough ground and the occasional bird call. Ben was in his element, his adrenaline pumping as he navigated the twists and turns with practiced ease. About halfway through his ride, he reached a narrow, winding section of the trail. The trees pressed close on either side, the undergrowth thick and tangled. He slowed, listening to the sounds of the forest around him. Just then, a sudden rustling came from the bushes to his right. He glanced over, and in a split second, his heart froze. A massive grizzly bear was crashing through the foliage, its eyes fixed on him, muscles rippling as it prepared to charge. Ben had no time to think. His instincts kicked in, and he ditched his bike, throwing it down as he turned and bolted toward the nearest tree. But the bear was already too close, hurtling forward with a speed and power that left him no time to think. He could feel the ground trembling under its weight as it closed in, each heavy step hammering into the earth. Ben reached the tree, a sturdy pine with branches low enough to climb. He leaped up, grabbing the first branch he could reach and pulling himself higher with all his strength. But just as he hauled himself up, the bear reached him, rearing onto its hind legs and swiping out with one massive paw. The swipe caught his backpack, shredding it open, tearing through the fabric and sending supplies tumbling down to the ground. Ben barely managed to scramble up another branch, the torn pack now hanging loose, its contents scattered below. He climbed higher, his heart pounding as he gripped the rough bark, ignoring the sting of splinters digging into his palms. Below him, the bear let out a low, rumbling growl, standing on its hind legs and stretching its powerful forelegs toward him, its sharp claws scraping the trunk. The beast's eyes were locked on him, filled with a primal fury, its jaws open, teeth glistening. Each snap of its jaws sent a shiver through him, the sound echoing in his ears. It wanted nothing more than to maul Ben. For the next few minutes, Ben stayed as high up the tree as he could manage, hoping and praying that the bear wouldn't climb after him. The bear didn't seem interested in climbing, but it didn't want to leave either. The animal circled the tree, occasionally lunging at the trunk. Ben felt grateful he was in good physical shape. Otherwise, he wasn't so sure he could have clung to the tree under the circumstances. Every so often, the bear would retreat a few paces, only to return with renewed determination, scratching at the bark, letting out deep guttural sounds that seemed to resonate in Ben's chest. The minutes dragged by, turning into an hour, then two, the bear showing no signs of tiring or losing interest. As time passed, Ben realized he had to stay calm. He started meditating, willing his muscles and bones to resist, to hold on. He knew that one slip could send him tumbling down, and if the fall didn't kill him, the bear certainly would. With each passing hour, the bear's growls grew softer, but it remained vigilant, circling the base of the tree with unrelenting focus. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the forest floor. But Ben couldn't let his guard down. His throat was dry, and the cold was starting to set in, the wind biting at his exposed skin. Every muscle in his body throbbed, his legs cramped from holding his position. Finally, as dusk settled over the forest, the bear seemed to lose interest, pacing a few times around the tree before slowly trekking off into the woods. Ben held his breath, watching as it disappeared through the trees, his eyes straining to follow its hulking form until the shadows swallowed it. He waited, muscles coiled, hardly daring to believe it was gone. Minutes passed in silence, the only sound of his own ragged breathing. When he was sure the bear had left, he climbed down, his legs shaking as they hit the ground. His body was sore, but he was grateful to be alive. He staggered back to where his bike lay sprawled across the path, one wheel slightly bent. His torn backpack and scattered belongings lay strewn across the ground, remnants of the bear's fury. But he didn't bother to collect them. His only thought was getting out of the woods and back to safety. He limped along the trail, pushing his bike beside him, glancing over his shoulder every few steps, half expecting the bear to reappear. Each crack of a twig, each rustle in the underbrush sent his pulse racing, his mind replaying the encounter, every detail etched into his memory. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the trailhead, his car just visible through the trees. Relief washed over him as he approached, his steps quicker now, fueled by the safety waiting just a few yards away. He climbed into the car, slumping back in the seat, his body finally releasing the tension it had held for hours. As he drove away, Ben couldn't shake the image of the bear's eyes, the sheer power in its gaze, and the relentless drive that had kept it circling his tree for hours. He'd had close calls in the wilderness before, but this was different. He now understood just how dangerous it was to venture into bear territory alone. It was late on the evening of October 17th, 2014. Shane Fender was tired and frustrated, trudging through the dense undergrowth of the Alaskan wilderness, every step sinking into damp moss and tangled roots. What was supposed to be a simple hiking trip had quickly turned into a nightmare. Somewhere along the trail, he'd missed a marker, veering further and further off course until he was completely lost. The forest around him grew denser, the shadows darker, the silence heavier. Panic gnawed at him as he pushed forward, his hope of finding his way back dwindling with every passing minute. Finally, through the trees, Shane spotted a small, weathered structure, a rustic ranger cabin. Relief flooded him as he stumbled toward it, eager for a place to rest and a chance to figure out his next move. The cabin looked abandoned, but its walls were solid and the roof seemed intact. At the very least, it was sheltered from the wilderness closing in around him. Or so he thought. He pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside, taking in the musty smell of old wood and stale air. Inside, the cabin was bare, with a small cot and a few shelves, likely left for rangers during extended patrols. It wasn't much, but it felt like a haven. He hoped someone might return soon, someone who could help him find his way back to safety. Until then, he decided to wait, easing himself onto the cot and letting his muscles relax for the first time since he'd realized he was lost. The stillness of the cabin was soothing and he felt the exhaustion settling in. But as he was starting to drift off, a faint sound outside snapped him back to attention. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunched through the brush, circling the cabin with a weight that made his pulse quicken. Shane held his breath, his senses sharpened by fear. The footsteps grew louder, followed by a low, grumbling growl that resonated through the walls. Then came the scratching, a thick, clawed paw raking against the cabin's wooden walls. Shane's mind raced as he realized what was out there. He'd heard stories of aggressive bears in Alaska, some brave enough to approach human structures. Panic gripped him and he froze, hoping the bear would pass by. But the scratching grew louder, moving along the wall as the bear seemed to trace his scent. Shane scrambled to secure the door, throwing the bolt across and pushing the cot against it, desperate for any extra barrier. His hands shook as he reinforced the windows with a few empty crates he'd found, hoping they would hold. The bear's breathing, deep and heavy, was audible through the thin walls. Shane could almost feel it. Each exhale sent chills through him, its hunger and determination palpable. Suddenly, the bear's massive head appeared at one of the small cabin windows, dark eyes scanning the interior. Its muzzle pressed against the glass, leaving smeared streaks of condensation as it sniffed, its hot breath fogging up the window. Shane backed away, heart pounding, knowing there was nothing between him and the beast except a thin pane of glass and the flimsy walls of the cabin. The bear began pawing at the window, claws scraping against the glass with a harsh, relentless sound that echoed through the cabin. The window rattled under the force, cracks splintering through the glass. Shane's mind raced, desperate for any plan, any way to fortify his meager shelter against the determined predator outside. But there was nothing, nowhere to run, no other escape. The bear prowled around the cabin, occasionally rearing up on its hind legs to test the walls and door, leaving claw marks in its wake. Each impact made the structure shudder, and Shane pressed himself against the farthest corner, trying to make himself as small and silent as possible. The bear huffed and snorted, circling again, its shadow falling across the cabin as it moved with terrifying purpose. Hours dragged by in this tense standoff. Shane's heart hammered in his chest, his ears straining to catch every sound, every growl and shuffle of the bear outside. The animal was relentless, scratching, sniffing, and occasionally letting out deep, frustrated huffs. Shane felt trapped in a nightmare, his body rigid with fear, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios, as the bear's presence dominated the small, confined space. Every time he thought it might finally be leaving, it returned, sniffing along the base of the walls, brushing up against the door with a heavy, unsettling thud. Shane could almost picture its massive claws tearing through the wood, ripping open the cabin and exposing him to its deadly power. As the hours crept on, fatigue began to weigh on him. His muscles were cramped from holding still, his nerves frayed from the constant tension. He fought to stay awake, knowing the bear was just outside, still determined, still hunting. He could hear it shifting, settling in as if it had decided to wait him out. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through him, but he had no choice but to wait, trapped until dawn. Finally, just as the first faint light of morning began to seep through the window, the bear seemed to lose interest. Shane stayed motionless, barely daring to breathe until he was sure it was gone. His whole body ached and his throat was dry from fear and exhaustion, but relief washed over him as the silence settled once again. Hours later, a group of rangers arrived, alerted by Shane's family when he hadn't returned from his hike. They found him pale and shaken, still inside the cabin, his makeshift barricades barely holding up. The rangers explained the bear's behavior. It was known to be dangerously bold, accustomed to human presence, and relentless in its search for food. They'd been tracking it for weeks, and Shane's arrival in its territory had likely triggered the prolonged encounter. With a final warning about the dangers of hiking off-trail, the rangers guided him back, leaving the cabin and the memory of that terrifying night behind.